founder of Tenacious Change, LLC, and has been a nonprofit organization leader for his entire career, having created his first community initiative for youth when he was 18 years old. So that's pretty darn impressive, Tom. Since then, most organizations he has worked with and led have been youth-serving organizations. The scope of service areas of the organizations have ranged from local rural to local urban to statewide to regional to national and even international. As a leader, Tom has had a range of responsibilities as well as creating, growing, maintaining, sustaining, and even in some cases, mercifully putting to rest organizations. So welcome, Tom, to the webinar today.
It's really great to see you again, Liz, and really terrific to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, Tamarack and Tenacious Change are great partners, so we're very happy to welcome you. And before we go into our conversation, I just wanted to introduce everybody to who is in our virtual room. And so we have a fairly large virtual room. I think we have nearly 700. It says on this slide 650, but I think we had some last minute additions due to an email you sent out. So we're at nearly 700 learners from Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, UK, Singapore, Brazil, France, Israel, Mexico, the Philippines, and South Africa. So we've got quite a bit of the globe covered today for this webinar. And we've got folks representing a whole variety of different sectors, including the community sector, those of you that work in consulting, those of you in education, that work in philanthropy, for government, and then health. And I'm sure that within those broad ranges, there's more defined topics that you all are also very interested in. And so hopefully today you'll get some wisdom out of the webinar, and we look forward to hearing from you in the chat box, but also welcoming your questions in the Q&A box. So if you, during the course of the webinar, if you have any questions for Tom, please put them into the Q&A box, and we will bring them up at the end of the webinar and have an opportunity to tackle some of them. So thanks for that. This is our agenda. So we've done introductions. We're going to enter into an interview with Tom, and then we have a nice amount of time for questions and answers. And then we're going to end the webinar with a few announcements at the end of the session. And so let's go to our first question, Tom. And so I want you to tell us a little bit more about your work at Tenacious Change. And then also tell us a little bit about how the COVID pandemic has really shifted the way you work in the last few months. And as you're doing that, I invite the folks that are on the call to also put into the chat box how COVID might have been impacting their work, because I think we're all interested in, how our worlds have been changing over the last couple of months. So over to you, Tom.
All right. Well, thanks, Liz. Well, I started Tenacious Change in 2013. And with the primary desire and mission really to animate leaders, organizations, and in fact, entire communities to lead change for the greater good. And so that's largely what we do. I do that through a lot of consulting work. I do that through some workshops and training and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's pretty much what Tenacious Change is about as a company. How in the world has COVID-19 changed how I do that work? Well, obviously, absolutely everything has gone online, Liz, as I'm sure you have experienced up there at Tamarack. And so I have become far more proficient at Zoom and doing things online than what I have been in the past, although I've done a lot of work on Zoom over the years. So and I've taught some college courses using Zoom. So I'm quite familiar with it, but it's a very different kind of experience to have everything really go online in that way. And so for me, that means that I'm trying to figure out how do I translate some of that work that I have done face-to-face in person with people to the online environment. And that in itself can be a little bit challenging, but we're getting there. I've also been able to finish a couple of research projects I've been working on. I have been developing some new skills related to video editing and website construction. And I have been blogging like crazy. I've been writing a daily blog since March 17th. And I just changed the format slightly because we're technically no longer under a sheltering in place order here in Maryland. So I've started publishing it under my other favorite title, which is called The Daily Drivel. And so it's out there now, and I invite people to stop by and take a look at my website. It's on my website under Tom's blog.
I've been a big fan of the blog, Tom, and I think I've read it not every day, but certainly most days. And I think it's you provide an interesting perspective of both a personal perspective, but also kind of a state of the world perspective in terms of the blog. And, you know, I think often when I'm reading it, I think about how what you're writing about reflects some of the things that I'm thinking and some of the feelings that I'm having. So it's a really interesting blog to read, and I would encourage people to read it as well. You know, you write a lot of things, and one of the things that you wrote recently was a paper called Unlocking the Potential of Collective Change Leadership. And I wonder, you know, it's really connected to when we were talking about the title for this workshop around tenacity, humility, and community change leadership. Tell us a little bit about that paper and maybe some of the big ideas behind it.
Sure. So that paper, Unlocking the Potential of Collective Change Leadership, is really a formal introduction to Tenacious Change. And so Tenacious Change exists as an LLC, which is my company, and it also exists as an approach to how you go about facilitating or doing community and organizational change. And so the paper is actually a more formal and complete introduction of that, of the operating principles of Tenacious Change that are really informed by community development philosophy and utilize collective change leadership to facilitate some of that community change. So it's based on research and work that I've been doing for several years and trying to figure out how to actually articulate how do you do collective impact without making it into a formula, a checklist, or a recipe. I think in the US, of course, which is where I'm based, it's easy for organizations and communities to fall into this one-size-fits-all kind of trap for solutions to complex problems. We tend to want quick and easy solutions, and that lends itself to getting into some dangerous places for us, you know, in trying to simplify something that is really, really very, very complex. But what I've tried to do with Tenacious Change is design it in a way that allows us to avoid some of those pitfalls, yet provide a set of simple rules to guide tailoring for the process of change. So you won't find a checklist, you won't find a recipe, but what you will find are principles to help guide that process of community change, and effectively, how do we actually do collective impact?
That's really interesting. You know, a week ago, I was talking to Glenda Oyoung from the Human Systems Dynamics Institute, and she talked about this concept of simple rules or a set of principles. And I think, you know, when we're working in the area of complexity, that's even more important to kind of bring those rules forward. And in some ways, they tried to do that, I think, with the collective impact approach. The 5 conditions are really a set of simple rules, but they're not a recipe, right? And I think, right. You know, I think when we try to look upon them as a recipe, we that's where we, you know, get into the challenge, because it's about putting these rules in connection with complexity.
Right. Absolutely. And actually, you know, it was at a Tamarack event, wow, I want to say 2014, where I met Brenda Zimmerman and got to sit in on her plenary session and her workshops, and was really inspired around some of these ideas that are now coming to fruition in Tenacious Change. And this whole idea of, you know, when we're dealing with complex situations, we do want to go for, there are not necessarily simple solutions to those, but there are certainly simple rules that we can apply that allow us the freedom for the solutions to really emerge from moving forward in trying to address those complex problems. Yeah.
So let's look at that a little bit deeper. So you describe in the paper these kind of 5 processes or 5 ways of being. So what are they, and why are they important for us, particularly if we're leading change, right? If we're at the kind of forefront or we're enabling change to occur.
Right. So actually the process is try to get to that answer that question about, I want to have a collective impact initiative. I want to have a collaborative effort to lead this community change or this organizational change, but I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. How do I actually go about doing that? So the processes are really designed to try to answer that particular question. Now, and actually, one of the things that I found to be really, really useful was the paper that you and Mark Kabaj did on Collective Impact 3.0. Because as you'll see from the graphic here, what FSG did is they did just a brilliant job of describing those 5 conditions, right? And I'm thinking back to the early days of collective impact, and people had these 5 conditions in front of them, and they were trying to figure out, okay, but what does this mean? Well, a significant contribution that you and Mark made was in explaining what they mean by describing them or defining them more completely. You talked about community aspirations, strategic learning, high leverage activities, authentic community engagement, containers for change, and you gave a little bit more meat to that. And so when I saw your Collective Impact 3.0 paper, and actually, Liz, if I'm correct on this, I think maybe I may have been a reviewer on that paper before it went public even. When I saw that, I thought, wow, this is exactly what we're trying to get at with Tenacious Change is so we see Tenacious Change as really an extension of FSG, but more specifically an extension of the definitions that you gave to those to the 5 conditions. So in other words, if we're achieving community readiness, part of what we have to do is that we have to identify the community aspiration. If we're monitoring and adapting as we go, which is a process that we can teach people to do, then we're actually engaging in strategic learning. When we are leading and working collaboratively, one of the reasons we do that, that we learn to work collaboratively, is so that we can have those tough conversations about what are the high leverage activities that are actually addressing the problem that we're trying to address. So many times when groups have come together in the past, there gets to be a little bit of tension in the room around, whose activity is going to be on the forefront, who's going to get funded, who's not going to get funded. Well, the logical answer ought to be is let's look at what is working best, and that's where we're going to put our energy. And so until we have the trust that comes from leading and working collaboratively together, it may be very difficult to have some of those conversations around those high leverage activities. And then facilitating and increasing community participation is part and parcel with authentic community engagement. If you don't actually have the community there, you can't engage with them authentically. And conversely, authentic community engagement means that you're going to facilitate and increase participation from the community. And then finally, and this is probably the last piece that really fell into place for us, was thinking about this concept of the containers for change. And how we saw that functioning within the Tenacious Change approach is really in terms of orchestrating, that there has to be this group that is making sure that those other 4 processes are taking place and moving along. And so the role of the collective change leadership group or collaboration really becomes one of orchestrating, making sure those other things take place.
Tom, it occurs to me as I'm listening to you kind of go through this slide, is that it might be helpful for the group of listeners on this call to provide their feedback. And if they have any feedback, please put it into the chat box, because what we'll do is we will gather your feedback after this call, and I'll send it on to Tom, and he can take a look at it and really kind of think about, muse around a little bit more, and be informed by, you know, the folks that we have and their wisdom that we have. We're kind of crowdsourcing here.
Yes.
Tom, I was thinking, you know, I was also thinking as you were talking, and this would be a thing that I would add as a piece of feedback, is tenacious. The idea behind tenacious change is that it is embodying change, right? It is
Yes.
about the tenacity that you have, the continual kind of attention that you're paying, and the intention that you have in terms of driving the doing forward, right? So it almost is like it should have a second line that says, you know, it has these kind of components to it.
Yeah, and I would extend that a little bit and say that there's a quality of change, that change itself is tenacious. That we know more than make a change in something, and already the change is beginning to happen for the next iteration. And so we make the mistake when we think, okay, hey, we've made a change, I guess that's it for a while. No, it's as soon as we think we're settled, everything's going to change again on us, and we need to be a part of that change, or we're forever trying to play catch up.
Yeah, you know, I think Brenda Zimmerman talked about, and Mark Kabaj talks a lot about act, react, and adapt, right?
Yeah,
And in some ways, tenacious change is about that, right? It's about that
absolutely.
kind of acting in change, reacting at what's happening in real time, and then adapting for the next iteration, right? And I think, you know, I think that's interesting because we've learned so much since that initial article from FSG in 2011. We've learned so much about how this community change work happens. And I think that all of these are iterations of the same thing, but with that kind of next level of knowledge that we have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you know, we spend our life standing on the shoulders of the people before us, right? And so, and so the same thing is here, is true in terms of the development of how we get better, is that we are constantly building upon one another to, and I look forward to see who eventually builds upon the tenacious change approach too. It'll
Yeah,
be exciting to see.
it's interesting, right? Because if you think about, there are lots of folks globally in the US and Canada and around the world that are working with a collective impact sensibility or a collective impact mindset. And
Right.
yet, we can really benefit, all of us, from adding to this, to the knowledge and to the capacity that we have. And I think that what you've done here is just another really nice iteration of all of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's move. Oh, let's move on to the next question. And so part of this webinar was to focus on, you know, the ideas behind tenacity and humility. And this is, I think, where we started our conversation a couple of months ago when we were thinking about doing a webinar together. And you were telling me about, you know, some folks that have influenced your thinking around, you know, this idea of tenacity and this idea of humility in leadership. And so maybe tell us what you think about that, and maybe some advice that you have for those of us that are collaborative leaders.
Well, so tenacity and humility. Since I had an initial conversation, Liz, I just continue to chew it over in my brain over and over again. They are very, very important for collaborative leadership, and in part that's because collaboration can be just really highly rewarding, and it can be wildly successful, but at the same time, it's really not easy. So the tenacity part comes in because collaboration is really, really hard. And I know you've heard the expression that working collaboratively is oftentimes like herding cats, and that is true. But there's another part of that. Sometimes those are just house cats, and sometimes they are feral cats. And and when you're dealing with feral cats, it can not only take a little while, but it can be a little risky. People can get their feelings hurt. There can be conflicts that occur, and so the willingness to stay in that while you're trying to figure out the collaboration and how it needs to work together is really, really important. And that's where one really needs quite a lot of tenacity. the humility piece is required when you're working in collaboration, because you're always going to find things that others can do something far better than what you think you can. And if you feel like you're the one that has to have all the answers and always be in the front position leading the way, that can really get to be problematic. And so it's where humility comes in and really plays a significant role, is it allows us to take a step back, and even if we occasionally imagine ourselves to be the great leader that we want to be, we are able to step back and let others step up and provide the leadership and the expertise they alone actually, can provide. In terms of my advice, in the second part of your question here, my best advice to collaborative leaders is really ancient wisdom that I wish I could claim, but I cannot. It goes back to Lao Tzu, who we know as the author, or we believe to be the author of the Tao Te Ching. He reminded us that when the best leader's work is done, the people say, or the collaborators say, we did it ourselves. When that happens, that's when we know that our collaborative leadership has really been successful, and what we've tried to do together, working together, has really come together well.
Yeah, it's interesting, Tom, as you were talking, I was thinking about how tenacity seems to be a driver, but humility seems to be a receptor, right? And so they almost seem counterintuitive to one another. And yet, as a collaborative leader, we actually need to have capacities for both.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. We do have to have that capacity for both. And there's actually, I'm still formulating this, but I probably in a little bit here, I want to say a little bit more about an article that we shared about confident humility. I'm still formulating that thought. So.
It is interesting, so listeners on the call, all of our conversations are iterative conversations. And so if you have comments that you want to put into the chat box around this, please do, because I think, we are journeyers with you, right? Yeah. And I think it's kind of interesting to consider, how these two, how we have to be tenacious, how we do, if we truly believe in something and want to work towards that change, we have to be tenacious towards it. But then really understanding that there are others that bring, skills, mindsets, capacities that we don't have in our toolbox. That's a really interesting kind of counterbalance. So the next question that we have is maybe putting you a little bit on in the chat box, but what's a challenging leadership experience that you've had, and where you've had to actually draw on both of these, both the notion of tenacity and this notion of humility?
Well, okay, I'm going to reveal my age here. Oh my goodness, this is actually going to take me back almost 40 years at the start of my career. And one of the first positions that I had was in leading a statewide youth program in the Midwest here in the U.S. And I held that position for about 11 years. And part of that role was that I ran a summer camp every year. And so typically we'd have somewhere between 125 and 200 campers and staff on site each week for the camping program. And I learned very quickly that it was really impossible for me to do my job and all the other jobs that needed to be done, in the camp. I mean, I couldn't stay in the cabins with the young people. I couldn't cook all the meals. It was not going to be possible for me to do that and to make sure that our campers had fun and that they remained safe. The only way it was going to work is if I learned how to work together with the rest of the staff, who were all volunteers. I was the only paid, and they were all volunteers, and they were only there 1 week at a time. Over the 11 years I held that position, I it took me a while, but I eventually learned how to work in collaboration with the counselors, the food service people, the grounds crew, the young people, to really ensure a memorable and healthy experience for everyone. That's not to say there weren't rough spots. There were rough spots. And there was times when I made really, really bad mistakes. But fortunately, I was working with a group of people that were very forgiving, and we were able to keep forging on. But that, when I think about that trying to balance that tenacity as driver and humility as the receiver, oh my goodness, that was it. Because I would look out over that campground and I would say, there's at least 5 million things out there that I have no control over. So what am I going to do about that? I mean, my personality is that I am a driver, that I'm a type A personality, and I want to feel like I have some control over what's going on. And I realized that I was not going to be a healthy person at the end of the camp season if I tried to control everything. So I had to begin to ask for that help. And when I did, much to my surprise and to my delight, people were very willing to help me out.
There's a really interesting and kind of useful exercise that our friends from Liberating Structures have as a tool. It's called the 15% solution, right? And it's an opportunity for us to invite contributions from other people. And I think, so often when we're trying to drive community change forward, we land in the tenacity part of it, but we don't invite the other part in, right? And
No.
so that 15% solution exercise, I use it a lot in my training because it actually gives people a practical way of contributing to the shared success. And that's what you were doing in your camp story, was giving people the opportunity to give their 15% to the solution that you're working on together. So it's a great little tool, and I know Duncan has just put it into the chat box that we have. So tell us a little bit about what you think community change makers can do practically to build their kind of this change leadership skill set. What can they do?
Well, actually, I'm going to go back to what I just said about the confident humility. Because I just as you asked that, it just hit me that, oh, okay, this is about confident humility. So you shared this article with me off of Medium. And so if people out there have Medium or can access Medium, they can find the article. It's just called Confident Humility. And so my advice would be to folks to really work at developing that sense of confident humility. And what that basically means, as I understand it, and as I've experienced it, and I won't say that I am an expert at this by any means. I struggle every day with this sense of confident humility as well. But what I understand of it, as I have learned about it, and as I've kind of sat with the phrase, and I think about how I embody that in my own life, is that you become confident both in what you know and what you don't know. And I will say that age is a great teacher. I know far less today at age 66 than I did at age 26 or 16. Definitely at age 16. I knew everything at age 16. So, but then we have to become humble enough to admit that we don't know everything, and that we are willing to really be accountable for our own mistakes, and that we are willing to be curious and to learn from others along the way. And what confident humility does is it kind of fuses. It brings together and integrates these two ideas without going to the extreme of others. The article talks about one extreme being arrogance, which they define as unbridled confidence, or passivity, which they define as unbridled humility. And neither of those serve us well when we're trying to work with others. So confident humility, according to the article, basically means that you know whether you are the best person to make a decision or to lead the way in that moment, and that if you are not, then you just get out of the way of others when they have that expertise and let them lead. And when you have determined that maybe I really am the best person to lead in this moment, then act boldly when you have that expertise. But at the same time, always boldly is different than being arrogant, and being willing to lead boldly with your expertise and being willing to let others lead when you don't possess it. That, I think, is the sweet spot that they're trying to define as confident humility.
Have you ever, Tom, have you ever looked at the Johari window?
Oh, I love the Johari window.
Yeah, because that's another tool, right? That has leaders reflecting on, and that's what it just raised for me. Have you leading, reflecting on, what you know about yourself, what you think other people know about you, what you think other people might say about you, and then your blind spot, right? And I think it's that kind of knowing yourself as a leader is I think a really critical competency to have.
You reminded me, Liz, I actually, about 3 years ago, developed a Johari window specific to community change.
Oh.
Yeah, I'll have to share that with you. I got to see if I can find it first.
Well, if you can find it, do send it to us, because at the end of this call, and in the next couple of days, we'll send out an email to everybody with the slides and the link to the call. And we'll include that if you can find it, Tom.
Yeah, I'll be happy. I'll take a look for it as soon as we're done here today.
Great. And so my final question is really the thoughts you'd like to leave the folks on the call with. But before you go into this question, I just want to remind people that we've got a number of questions in the Q&A box, and you can either add to that question, those of you that are on the line, or you can vote on one of the questions that other people have put up there. And then in a few minutes, Duncan will bring them forward. But before we do that, this is your question, Tom. What's some of your final thoughts, some of your final reflections?
So all of us are now realizing that a new normal awaits us in the future because of the pandemic. I don't think any of us imagines for one moment that things are not going to shift dramatically, and that the new normal is going to look very different than anything we've known in the past. I don't know whether that will be forever or just for the long term while we're waiting on a vaccine. I don't know, but things are shifting, things are changing dramatically. However, when we think back a few months, to January, December, we were already moving toward a new normal in community and organizational change, in which collaboration was becoming more and more important. Now, I say that specifically with reference to here in the US, because I think that Tamarack has really been leading the way in that for many, many years up in Canada. But here in the US, I've seen signs that we are slowly adopting a new normal around collaboration in community change. What the pandemic is doing is that it's accelerating us toward the new normal of collaboration. Think about it for just a second. 5 months ago, we have, I see on the screen here, we have about 234 people or no, actually a lot more people than that, I think, viewing this. And so back in January, if we would have said, if we would have thought that we would ever be spending so much time on Zoom, everybody would have said, absolutely not. There's nothing like face-to-face, in-person, being able to reach out and touch people and to shake their hands and just to be eyeball to eyeball with them. But you know what? Guess what we've done? We have adopted this as a new normal, and now it is what it is. We are so much, from the first or second time that we were on a Zoom meeting, we realized how dependent we were on others to do their work and hold up their end for us to be able to do our work, because we didn't have the ability to connect with them in any way other than this. So to be effective now, I guess what I would say to folks as we move into the question period is we have to collaborate now more than ever before, and we don't really have a choice. So let's do the logical thing and simply embrace it and welcome it and say, and begin to treat it like an old friend and say, this is the new normal and we're going to figure this out and it's going to be okay.
You know, it reminds me a lot of a webinar I did a week ago again with Glenda, where she talked about living the future today, right? And I think you're both. It's a similar pattern that I'm seeing, which is, you know, we sometimes try to look too far when the normal is in front of us, right? And how do
Right
we
here.
embrace what we have right now to build better? You know, build better connections, build better relationships, build, you know, call out things when they need to be called out that aren't working. So thanks for that, Tom. So I'm going to now open it up to the question and answer period. And so invite my colleague Duncan into the conversation. He's been responding as we've been coming up with tools and resources and papers. But Duncan, can you tell us about, or can you pose some of the questions that our listeners have put up?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you both. And thanks to everyone who have shared their questions. And just a reminder, even if you don't have a question, you can take a peek at the Q&A panel and you can actually click on the thumbs up button to vote for which questions speak to you. Our first question comes from Susan, actually in the chat box. And it says, can you address how you're defining issues in a way that starts with and deeply understands the grassroots community perspectives at the front of the work?
Is that me, you, or?
You go ahead, Tom, because I know that you do this a lot in terms of the processes that you facilitate with Tenacious Change, how you bring the community voice in. So why don't you talk about some of those processes?
Sure, absolutely. Well, one of the things that I have really seen as challenging over the last several years is how we have tried to accumulate community voice in the past. We have many times done a needs assessment, and then needs assessment can take many different forms. It might be a survey, it might be going house to house, and with a set of questions that we're trying to get answered. And we do that, and then we step away and we say, oh, okay, we've done the needs assessment, we got the community voice, all is good, we're done. I have never felt like that's been very satisfactory. In fact, I think that part of the way that we work to bring community voice in and to really hear and understand what the community is saying is that we spend time in the community and we seek not community knowledge but community understanding. And you don't get community understanding by simply doing a needs assessment. You do that by building relationships within the community. You do that by spending time within the community and really getting to know the people of community. One of the things that I often say to groups is this, that it's all about relationships. It's always about relationships. And the most important work that we do is the work of building relationships, because it's those relationships that then become a part of the what I just lost the term. I wanted the part of the whole universe of how we work together within the community to bring about long-lasting, meaningful change that is for the community, with the community, by the community. So, Liz, I see you want to say something on that, so feel free.
Yeah, so my colleague Sylvia talked about and shared with us some work when she co-facilitated with you in Palm Beach, Florida for the Palm Healthcare Foundation.
Yes.
And
yes.
One of the things that she noted was the way you had people fill in their name tags. So maybe you could share that with everybody, because I think that this for her was quite profound and actually changed the nature of the conversation at that community gathering. So maybe just share that with the group.
Sure. Actually, we facilitated an appreciative summit with about, I think in two different groups, the total was about 180 different people from across Palm Beach County on the issue of behavioral health. And one of the things that I asked the host to do was to prepare the name tags minus titles and minus last names. Well, I think maybe the last names were there, but we asked them to please leave off the titles. We didn't want doctors, reverends, so on and so forth, sitting in the room there. We just wanted people with first names. That was it. And it was really interesting when we got the feedback from people on that, how many people noticed that, and they said how much they were appreciated, that they didn't have any idea who they were sitting next to, and that as a result, they felt like they had opened up and really connected in a different way. So that's just one little thing that I've done in the past, is have a title-free zone when we bring the people together from the community, especially when it's a very diverse group and it's representative of all those sectors of the community, some of whom may feel a little intimidated by members of one of the other sectors of the community.
I think I love that idea, and I think it's a great approach. And I do think it is important to set ground rules, to level playing fields, and all those kinds of things that we need to consider in terms of really engaging people and engaging with their knowledge and their expertise. What's another question that we might have, Duncan?
Yeah, thank you both. Our next question comes from Rosalie, and they ask, how would you suggest we can increase community participation, especially during this time of physical distancing, and specifically for those who are not primarily online?
Mm-hmm. That's a great one. And Rosalie, when you get that one figured out, will you please let me know? No, actually, I have a couple thoughts on it. One is, and actually, Rosalie, if you do figure that out, let me know, seriously, because that is going to be one of the biggest challenges of working in this particular environment. I would say a couple of things about it, though. One is that let's not get away from the core principles of what relationship building is, which is in as much as possible communicating with one another, whether that is via video, whether it's by phone, whether it's by letter, whether it's by text, whatever it is. Communication is a way that we facilitate relationship. And then how we communicate is really important as well. If we're just communicating at a kind of a surface level or a professional level, then we can pretty much expect that that's going to be the level of relationship we're going to have. I think that one of the things that is so interesting about this time right now is that people are beginning to connect with one another at a little bit more personal level, around how they're doing in the pandemic, what is worrying them. We're seeing people come into meetings and all of a sudden their children pop up on the screen behind them, or their dog starts barking. And what this has done, which I think is fabulous, is it's kind of taken away the mystique of our lives, that we all live very human, normal lives with noises in the background and dogs that go running by and kids that want to Zoom bomb us and stuff like that. And so let's not be afraid to communicate at a more personal level, regardless of how that communication takes place. My feeling is that when I reach out to people in that way, then they reciprocate. And then that opens the door for me to share even more deeply with them and for them to share more deeply with us. I think it's going to take longer. I don't think it's going to be as quick to build relationships with people virtually, but it's possible. And actually, I've seen it happening. There's a group I meet with on Thursday afternoons. It just started as a lark. The group keeps meeting for an hour, 5 to 6 in the afternoon on Thursdays, and the relationships are deep there. They are very deep, and so it takes place. It does happen, but we're going to have to be more patient with it. But we're going to have to be willing to be personal as well.
It actually, what you just said ties really nicely back into the ideas around collective impact, right? Because when I think about collective impact, there's this process product tension, right? And so often I think in our community change work, we bias towards the product, how many of this, how many of that, what's the percentage? And we should, that's important. but we sometimes subvert the process, right? And
Yeah.
I think by being in this kind of shared experience, this gives us time to reflect a little bit more on the process. And I think what you're saying, Tom, is the process of connection, the process of building relationships is even more important. And I know that at Tamarack, one of the things that we've done a lot more over the last couple of months, not that we didn't have monthly meetings with our staff team because we're a virtual organization, but we've actually been a bit more purposeful in those monthly meetings and have been more connecting. And I know even with my own team, I connect more purposefully with them. And I think that we could be doing that in our community change work a lot more, with a lot more intention. Our friend Deb Halliday, your friend and mine, talks about when she launches a new initiative pre-COVID. When she launched a new initiative, she would have 100 cups of coffee with 100 people to talk about the initiative before she launched it, so that she had way more buy-in when she brought people around the table. And I think those processes are important, and I think this gives us an opportunity to spend a bit more time, but we've always got to balance process product, right?
Right.
Okay, Duncan, one more question I think we have time for, one or two.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Our next question comes from Shelley, and they ask, when working with small rural communities that have a deep history and culture of doing things the same way, bringing about any type of change is difficult. How can we succeed in bringing about change for the greater good when so many other organizations have failed?
Oh, wow. Really good question. First of all, I am a rural Iowa farm kid. I grew up in a town of 700 people in southeast Iowa, and I have a heart for the farmland, for the heartland, and for small towns. It is certainly what has contributed a lot to my life, and I think I understand what you're saying there, Shelley, because traditions run very, very deep in small towns, in part because it is those traditions actually give them their identity. And in my hometown, which if you know the sport of high school wrestling is the sport in Iowa. And my little town of 700 had one of the most remarkable wrestling teams in the history of the state. They went 30 years with the team. They were 17 years undefeated, and the other times they never had a losing season. And we produced an extraordinary number of college wrestlers, college coaches, so on and so forth. Even though the school closed in my hometown in 1993, almost 30 years now, we still have a wrestling program. We still have the Morning Sun Tigers. And it's a youth wrestling program because that is part of what gives that town the identity. So I think that the challenge that we have is understanding what is not only that observing that they not only are reluctant to change, but asking why, what's the meaning of staying the same to them, and understanding why it is that they are resistant to change, and then finding a way to honor that and work within that to facilitate the change that needs to take place. Now, the change for my town was the state closed the school, but they were still going to have a wrestling team no matter what, and they did. And they still had an identity, and that was very, very important to them. So I think that in a rural setting like that, even though you may be talking fewer people, that's a place where the relationships are even more important. And because it's in the context of building those relationships and really getting to know and understand people and what is important to them, that you begin to understand what are the places where change is possible, and what are the places where that maybe you're not going to make a whole lot of progress right now. And then we have to become comfortable with what it is that we're learning from that experience. Small towns can change, and small towns do change, and rural settings do change. but it may take a little bit longer because the meaning of why it is that they are as they are may be that much more important to them to simply for their preservation as a community. And they could feel very, very threatened by change that we may be trying to introduce. Just some random thoughts on that. Liz, did you have anything?
No, I think that was really well said. So Duncan, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, I think we can sneak one more in. This question comes from Melissa. And they ask, in reviewing literature around collaboration, there's quite a bit on the motivations that lead to collaborative partnerships. What seems not to be as prominent is the information around what sustains collaborative partnerships. Would you have any insight into some of the things that are needed to keep the partnership strong?
One word: trust. You know, and Liz, I think back to the paper that you did on trust and turf, and I forget the complete title of it, but I think that one of the pieces that came out of that paper and that you highlighted was the absolute role, the absolutely significant role that trust plays in building a collaborative relationship. And when a collaboration fails, it is most often because something has happened to really shake the collaboration at the trust level. And so one of the things that we always want to do with a collaboration is to find what are the levers we need to push and pull to make sure that the trust stays in place within it. You know, it can sometimes going to a little bit of group dynamic theory here. Anytime a group changes, then you're automatically thrown back to a early formative stage of the group in which trust making really becomes one of the most important pieces of work that you do. And if we fail to do that when we need to do it in a group, then we could be setting ourselves up for some disintegration of the collaboration and eventually its collapse. So I just keep coming back to trust. I really do. Liz, did you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. Thanks for the shout out, Tom. But I also think, you know, what your points raise for me is that we also have to recognize when it's time to end things, right? And sometimes they end because they're broken, because of a broken trust, but sometimes they end because the energy has dissipated or we've solved the problem, right? And, you know, a lot of us are not very good at ending. Most of us like keep things going despite, you know, the things that we've achieved or despite the fact that we don't have any more resources for it or, you know, whatever number of reasons. And I think we have to also be good at celebrating endings and ending things in a good way to say, here's what we've learned out of this experiment. We're going to give us a break now, and maybe something will emerge in the future, but let's end it here, celebrate it, and create the space for new things to grow. So that would be what I would add to this conversation.
And that's probably why Bruce Tuckman, to his 4 stages of group development, eventually added the 5th stage, which is adjourn.
Yeah.
That a group has to find a way to adjourn in a positive and healthy way. So I think that's an excellent point. Thank you.
So over to you, Duncan, to wrap us up for today.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Tom, for sharing your insight and your wisdom with the group. It's been, I think, a really good conversation. And I think there's lots of resources people can dive into. I just have a few short announcements before we head out. The first is that throughout the month of June and into July, the Tamarack Institute is committed to bringing free weekly community building webinars to help equip you for community change. You can join us for discussions on things like systems change, evaluation, reconciliation, and much more. And if you can't join the live event, we still invite you to come and register, and we'll send you a full recording of the call. As well, in a few days, we're going to send you an email that has the full recording of today's discussion, a copy of the slides, and all of the links that have been shared in the chat box. And as well, as you leave today's webinar, you'll be prompted to take a quick survey. We really encourage you to fill this out. It'll take a minute or two, and it really helps us continually improve our weekly webinar offerings. If you want to learn more about us, you can visit us at tamarackcommunity.ca. Thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful day.